I wanna meet Santa Claus, the real Santa. I wanna meet Santa Claus, the real Santa. I wanna see
Beach Boys all over your radio. Nothing says Christmas like surfing. Well, unless, of course, you're a surfer, then of course it does. It makes perfect sense. Welcome back to the show. Welcome to the Sheldon McLeod Show for this December 19th. It looks as though traffic's not as perhaps busy as it was earlier today. I don't know. It's going to be crazy around the malls, around the shopping districts for sure for the next several days. And maybe it's going to be a bit stressful for you and your family. We're going to talk about, the Carlton, and looking back on Much Music Days, Mike Campbell for his monthly visit coming at 1:30. That sounds wrong, inappropriate, but anyways. Tim Bousquet, Leslie Lowe from Municipal Matters. Now, today, right now, let's talk a little bit about anxiety and stress, how we all want to have the perfect Christmas, and sometimes that drives us to what? Over-stressing. Dr. Simon Sherry, professor and director of clinical training, Department of Psychology and Neuroscience, the Department of Psychiatry. That's all with the university, which Dalhousie University.
Dalhousie.
And Dr. Simon Sherry, when they said, hey, do you want to talk about this? I said, yes, but it has to be in studio. Has to be in studio because this is a tough time of year for some people. If you had someone close to you who passed away during the holidays, or you had a relationship that ran into troubles over the holidays, all of these things, when we were talking about Christmas music, it's the only style of music that we drag out the old hits and listen to stuff from the 30s every single year. I guess to be mindful of these triggers is one thing to perhaps help us cope.
Well, we're told it's to be the most wonderful time of the year.
Says who?
Exactly, because more people are telling us in surveys and in scientific research that this may very well be the most stressful, anxious, pressured, overloaded time of the year.
It's one thing to have kids and to see Christmas through their eyes. And that was really wonderful when they were small. But even then, not sleeping, not eating right, staying up too late. And I'm not just talking about the adults, the kids too, and how to temper that. So what is it? How should we perhaps reassess or reevaluate or perhaps redraw our expectations this time of year?
Well, I think the idea of reevaluating how we're going about Christmas is a good one. As it's happening right now, there's extreme emphasis on the commercial aspects of Christmas. Front and center, first and foremost, is giving and receiving gifts. And I think that commercialization is breeding dissatisfaction. What seems to be creating a more enjoyable Christmas for people is when they're placing more emphasis on experiences, less emphasis on things, when they're placing more emphasis on family, less emphasis on commodifying everything.
He's a clinical psychologist, is that correct?
You've got it.
So what do we see this time of year? What kind of, do you find that people reach out, or is it, obviously people have vacation, people take time off this time of year. Is it harder to find someone to talk to this time of year if you're having anxiety over the holidays?
This is far from scientific, but anecdotally in the work I do as a clinical psychologist, it's been about a decade now, and every year I notice that my phone rings more and my inbox gets full when it comes to the work I do as a clinical psychologist. I think there are objectively a lot of people hurting around this time of year. And part of that may be that their own experience contrasts what's so aggressively marketed to us. It's supposed to be an ideal time of the year. It's supposed to be a time when families commune. It's supposed to be a perfect sort of Christmas. And inevitably our lives are less than perfect. And when people fall short of that ideal, they often feel bad.
We have as our guest in the studio Dr. Simon Sherry, a clinical psychologist. And we didn't necessarily promote this as a chance for you to call in, but if you're interested perhaps in asking a question or giving your observation, 902-405-6000, 1-877-801-8255. When we look at this busy month, and there's so much packed into the month of December, and the schools are still in, kids are still at class, and I can guarantee you not a whole lot's happening in the elementary school this time of year. So when the teachers say, okay, hey, you're now the responsibility of your parents. We're handing you over do the schools recognize perhaps what this may mean to the kids, or is it about amping them up too? I'm just kind of curious as to whether or not this is something you've thought about.
Well, I was up late last night because I attended my son's Christmas concert, and they did an absolutely fabulous job. but I was also observing how much time and energy and effort went into this. It was a real extravaganza of sorts, and I'm sure it places a lot of stress on teachers this time of year because it's their time to trot out their kids and have them perform. And it was a great show, and I enjoyed it as a passive audience member.
Yeah.
But as I was looking across the gymnasium, I saw an awful lot of stressed out teachers at the same time.
Well, yeah. Okay. We get this off the list. Is that what people are doing? Let's just get this off the list.
I think Christmas has become this juggernaut. There's so many expectations and so many plans. It's become, in a sense, burdensome. And it's also become unavoidable. If it's a time of year, and December is 1/12 of the year, where something difficult or annoying or bad has happened to you, maybe even something more negative than that, like something traumatic, it's then become really hard to avoid Christmas. April 24th, 2019 is Secretary's Day. You can avoid that if you want. You can just pretend it's not happening, stick your head in the sand and move on. But you can't do that for Christmas at this point. And there are so many prompts and cues and reminders. If Christmas has negative associations for you, it's ubiquitous and you can't get away from it, at least in Halifax in 2018.
Dr. Simon Sherry is here as our guest in the program this afternoon. Again, the idea of finding this perfect holiday, tempering those expectations. But again, no one wants to disappoint. So how do you perhaps, if you are struggling, if you are finding it's a bit of a drain, how do you communicate to the people around you who just say, oh, buck up? It's that age-old depression scenario where people say, oh, just cheer up, not recognizing clinical depression and perhaps how it manifests.
Well, it's often much more complicated than just cheering up or perking up. Oftentimes, Christmas has become stale and really routinized. It's the same dull routine. And I think sometimes it takes an external event, like the arrival of a child to a family, to disrupt that routine, or someone to consciously and strategically decide to do things differently. And there are lots of examples I would hear in my day-to-day life where this year the family's decided not to place so much emphasis on giving gifts, or they've decided to do something proactive like go tobogganing, weather permitted, or head to the Oval, to do something to scramble up a routine that's become dull, stale, and lifeless.
We're going to take our break. And again, if you have a question or a comment, 902-405-6000. Want to talk about overeating, over-consuming, perhaps depending on alcohol to help get you. This is a time I'm going to tell you the lines at the liquor store are just as long as they are everywhere else. And cannabis is legal this year, which is an added, perhaps, dimension to this story. We're going to talk about trying to keep the joy of the season there and not blaming anyone if it's not. But we're going to try and unpack that in a bit. We'll be right back with more. Welcome back. Clinical psychologist Dr. Simon Sherry, our guest in the radio studio this afternoon. We're talking about creating that perfect holiday, or the stress that comes along with trying to make everybody happy. And ultimately, is it fair to say that if you're trying to make everybody else happy, that it's more likely that you'll end up unhappy?
Yes, I think oftentimes around something like Christmas, you have to give up control. Stop trying to perfect yourself and those around you. Ultimately, you can't control other people.
You can control nothing. You're out of control. You have no control, really?
There's got to be some room for volition there, and I certainly think around the holidays you can be personally responsible for your own behavior, but when you're needing to micromanage everyone else in the service of having them live out your perfect Christmas, that's a problem.
There's a real family dynamic that happens this time of the year with the grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins and all of the people in your life. And years ago, situation happened, and I came to the realization that I cannot control the insanity in someone else's life, but I can control whether or not they're in my life and whether that impacts me or influences me. That doesn't come without, its own challenges itself, right? Especially if it's somebody close to you. But with that in mind, trying to, again, temper the season and, that age-old, I'm just going to have a drink. I'm just going to and this year, I'm just going to go down to the NSL Weed and buy some pot. There's a real likelihood that some people will be using that to cope. How can you recognize the difference between having a good time and running away from your life?
Well, there's a lot of important issues you bring up there. First of all, we know that Christmas is a time of overconsumption. and that can involve food, alcohol, or other drugs. And we also know, unfortunately, that the Christmas coronary is a real thing. In other words, there's a spike in heart attacks that coincides directly with the Christmas season. And at this point, this is a robust epidemiological finding. So we do have to be careful with overindulgence over the holidays. You also see a spike in alcohol-related fatalities, mostly due to drinking and driving. So there's some very serious concerns here. In terms of what you were discussing, I think the key word I'd pull out of what you said is to cope. If you're smoking to cope or drinking to cope, that's a pretty unhealthy motive for the use of a substance. If the primary driver of why you're using alcohol is to cope with anxiety, depression, or stress that you can't otherwise deal with, then what we see is when people have that motive to drink, their drinking tends to escalate to darker places like binge drinking or other hazardous forms of drinking. Certainly there are comparatively sound reasons to have a drink. It disinhibits you a little bit. It feels good. It makes you a little chattier. It helps fit in and bond with others. But if you're drinking to cope, if you're drinking to deal with life, that tends to go to a bad place.
How do you know, though, when you've stepped over that line?
I think oftentimes the world will tell you when you've done that, be that a spouse or a policing agency or someone else. There's feedback for you. It's not really the frequency with which people drink that gets them into trouble. It's oftentimes how much they drink and how quickly they drink. And even then, some people seem to be able to do that without creating a lot of immediate problems. And other people obviously have all sorts of difficulties, problems with relationships, problems with work start to come up, problems with their mental and physical health as well.
There is a phrase, functioning, a functioning alcoholic, a functioning drug addict. So when you hear that terminology, is that a clinical terminology in any way?
Well, I would say there's an inaccurate stereotype being that someone who drinks a lot, for example, is often lazy and they don't care and they're kind of slovenly people. That's not what I see at all. Many of the people I see who drink heavily are extremely self-critical about it. They're very conscientious, hard-driving, guilt and shame-prone individuals. As for the idea of a functioning alcoholic, there are certainly people who can maintain a job, but then their personal life might be a train wreck because it involves drinking, and that's a not uncommon scenario, I would see.
We've been pretty clear since this conversation nationally happened about legalizing cannabis that when people were of a mind that, oh, well, cannabis is not addictive. I've been pretty clear on the show and bringing in experts like yourself who said that's not true. That cannabis, you can be addicted to just about anything. And, there's probably an example of it just about everywhere in Hollywood if you want to start to look for it. But again, this is the first year that cannabis is legal over the holidays. I don't think that's going to perhaps drive more people to use. I don't think it will, though, dissuade those who have been using from continuing to do so. So anything we should be thinking about this time of year when it comes to this new legal substance?
Absolutely. You're correct to identify that cannabis is addictive. It's truly a myth to argue otherwise. What you'll see consistently is that 1 in 10 adults who begin smoking cannabis graduate to having an addiction. And even worse, 1 in 6 adolescents who begin smoking cannabis graduate to having an addiction. When it comes to cannabis, what do I mean by an addiction? Well, you develop a tolerance where you have to use more and more of it. You become physiologically dependent to it, such that when you stop using it, there are symptoms of withdrawal, which could include irritability, agitation, stomach upset, sleeplessness, and so forth. And with cannabis, you really see that it occupies a lot of time. You can spend a lot of time under the influence of the drug. You can spend a lot of time anticipating the use of the drug or dealing with the consequences of not being on the drug. And then that starts to jam you up in your day-to-day life where you're not working effectively or relating effectively to loved ones, coworkers, family members, and so forth.
Our guest is Dr. Simon Sherry. He's a professor and director of clinical training at the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Dalhousie in the Department of Psychiatry. He's also a clinical psychologist. Okay, we've kind of touched on a lot of the high points here, so to speak, pardon the pun. But when we get a little bit closer to this big day and there's this, oh, no, I just have to pick up a few more things, I'll worry about the bills in January. I know that was another issue that you wanted, that brings stress to people this time of the year, the financial strain. So I know you're not a financial expert, but from your perspective and how people react to this kind of stress, what should we do to try and perhaps roll this back or lessen the stress?
I think people are making these purchases in a loving, caring, and kind way. They're, in their mind, investing in a better Christmas for those around them. But I think that's misguided behavior. I don't think that you can purchase a better Christmas by doubling down on commodities. I'd encourage people to invest differently, to invest in activities with their family that foster connection, to invest in trying to build close relationships with others. If you're at all of a religious mindset, invest in some of the traditions and rituals around that for the holidays. Because if you look at what people are telling us when we study them, it's connection to family, it's experiences that are meaningful, and religious activities that seem to make the holiday more enjoyable.
Dr. Simon Sherry is here with us. Just a few seconds left. Mark sent us an email while we were chatting. Can you explain the substance in cannabis that makes it addictive? He says, I've never heard of anyone being addicted to cannabis.
Okay, so there are two main ingredients, in addition to about 100 other chemicals in cannabis, and THC and CBD are the main chemicals that we understand the best within these substances, various substances from joints to dabs to edibles that people are using when it comes to cannabis. And people become physiologically dependent on these substances. The THC within cannabis is particularly harmful, and so when we encourage people to use cannabis, we ask them when people use cannabis, we encourage them to consider to keep the THC levels as low as possible, because the THC is a psychoactive component within cannabis, and it's related to more mental health problems, notably psychosis, but also a range of other difficulties. So when you purchase cannabis, keep in mind that it's useful to keep these THC levels as low as you can. As for the addiction, there are cannabinoid receptors within the brain, and when you consume cannabis, it interacts with those receptors in such a way that you can eventually become dependent on it. What you see with cannabis users is when they reach the state of a problematic addiction, they don't deal with emotions. They don't cope with day-to-day life. They just immediately turn to cannabis as a solution. And in a sense, it is a solution in that it alters the circuitry within their brain, so they get a sensation of pleasure. But when that's the only way you can deal with life, your solution has become your problem.
Dr. Simon Sherry, we touched on a lot of information here, and do you have a website, a personal website?
I do. You could check us out at cruxpsychology.ca.
CRUX psychology.ca.
Absolutely.
Dr. Simon Sherry, Merry Christmas.
Happy holidays to you for sure.
Find the happiness in the holidays and don't get too stressed.
Sounds like a good message.
All right.